Today we're going to talk about habeas corpus, a seemingly arcane term, but one that is extremely important to the foundation of our Western legal tradition and our American legal and constitutional tradition. Habeas corpus is a seemingly, like I said, a seemingly arcane and difficult idea to understand, but it's very simple at its base, at its core. It simply means that there has to be a reason why you're being held by a government. There needs to be a reason. You can't just be taken up in the middle of the night, in the classic example justifying habeas corpus, squirreled away into a secret prison somewhere, and be held without charge. And this is, when we think about it, one of the most fundamental rights and one of the most fundamental parts of any kind of legal system that imagines itself to be one based on justice and one based on limited government and one based on popular sovereignty. That the government must give some reason. Doesn't have to be a good reason, but it must give some reason why it's holding you or why it's taking your life, your freedom away. Okay? Habeas corpus is in the Constitution. It's in Article 1, and it is in the form, it's in an interesting form. It's called the suspension clause of the Constitution, and it provides that the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. So there are some scholars who argue that we really don't have a specific right to habeas corpus, like we have a specific right to protection from, say, unreasonable searches and seizures. It says this is a privilege, and it doesn't talk about it in an affirmative way. It just says that it cannot be suspended. So there is some disagreement among some scholars about the original understanding of the suspension clause and habeas corpus in the Constitution. But habeas corpus, or at least the term habeas corpus in different formulations, it predates even Magna Carta, where we say that we get our idea of due process of law from 1215. I mean, we see the first instances of habeas corpus in 1199, 16, 17 years before Magna Carta. And it had a storied development in history in England and in the British territories and British colonies, not here in the United States, but throughout the Western world. But here in the United States, our first national conception of habeas corpus comes in the form of the suspension clause. It should also be noted, though, that various states had habeas corpus available to its citizens even before the Revolution, when they were British colonies. So there has always been then state habeas corpus and federal habeas corpus. And the suspension clause refers to federal habeas corpus. The suspension clause also suggests that habeas corpus is somehow potentially linked to war or extraordinary periods of conflict or unrest. And that's certainly the case. And that's how I want to give a quick survey of the development of habeas throughout American history, is to break it into two parts. One is its extraordinary use during periods of war or crises. And the other, and actually more frequent use and abuse, as we'll come to see, of habeas corpus is in its ordinary use. In its ordinary use in day-to-day, state-level or federal-level criminal and civil cases. Although I won't get into the civil cases, habeas corpus applies in many different areas of the law, from the death row inmate, either in state prison or in federal prison, to civil cases involving domestic issues about child custody. So it runs the gamut of American law. But I'm going to break it up for you here into two different categories. And we'll first talk about its ordinary use. As I said, every state had provisions that provided for habeas corpus. So in the antebellum period, though, as we've talked about in other lectures, we didn't have the Bill of Rights incorporated against the states. In the antebellum period, we didn't have the 13th, 14th, or 15th Amendments, or any other subsequent amendments, obviously. And we also had a pretty strong commitment to states' rights. And in fact, the very first Congress and the Judiciary Act of 1789, which has been the subject of other talks, it provided that federal courts, up into and including the Supreme Court, could issue writs of habeas corpus. In other words, somebody could challenge their detention through a writ of habeas corpus, and if that would be the case, if you file a writ because I detained you, a judge would command me to bring your body before him or her and give cause to why I should hold you. If I have no cause at all, you are immediately set free. But when we talk about federal habeas corpus, first of all, there were very few federal crimes in the antebellum period. Most crimes were on the state level. So we had state habeas, which varied considerably in the antebellum period. More importantly, those state habeas decisions, say we have a judge in Mississippi hear a habeas, issue a habeas petition, hear it, and says, well, it's all right to hold this person. Well, they have no recourse anywhere else. The matter just ends there. However much habeas the state provides is however much habeas you get, in a sense. It could not go to federal court until later, and I'll talk about that in a minute or two. But habeas's use on the state level in the antebellum period is fascinating, because we think of it, as I began this lecture, as the cornerstone of our Western legal tradition. Blackstone called it a bulwark of our liberties, the great and efficacious writ. But in the antebellum period, it was used for both noble and ignoble purposes, good and bad purposes, particularly with respect to slavery. In the South, for example, in Mississippi in particular, if I stole your slave, you could ask a judge to issue a habeas writ, okay, to me, to demand that I bring the body of that slave before the judge and show cause why I should own him or her and not you. Certainly not the way that we imagine the great and efficacious writ working. Similarly, if a slave absconds or runs away from the plantation in the South and goes to the North, what northern states would do, as kind of the proxy war of slavery, the Cold War of slavery before the Civil War, states that were sympathetic or had individuals in the state that were sympathetic to anti-slavery arguments would hold that slave and hide that slave. Habeas was issued to show cause why that person would be holding someone or hiding somebody. It was also the case that when federal marshals were committed to hunting down fugitive slaves, state authorities would arrest federal marshals, and federal courts would issue habeas writs to the state authorities to justify why they have national law enforcement officers in custody without cause. So, again, it's a fascinating developmental story of how habeas operates in the antebellum period. And habeas really is, in a sense, then, an umbrella right. It serves as a proxy for other sorts of rights that we recognize as important at any one particular time in American political history. That's why, for example, you could have good and bad uses of it from our modern-day perspective. Certainly a good use of it would be to free someone who's innocent and being held in some kind of arbitrary way, right? But we would all probably think that a bad and ignoble use of the writ is when I steal your slave and we use habeas, the great writ of liberty, to not free this person or have a discussion about freedom, but to send him to one owner rather than another. But that was the case because we recognize different sorts of rights and different sorts of commitments to these ideas in the antebellum period. But with the Civil War, and I will get back to the Civil War when we talk about in war, during and after the Civil War, there was a kind of a recommitment to national power, an enlargement of national power at the end of the Civil War and during the period of Reconstruction, particularly when we passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. At the same time that we were passing those Reconstruction amendments, though, the national government, again, characteristically during this period of increased national power, amends that original Judiciary Act of 1789 passed by Congress, allowing basically for the first time the removal of state habeas cases to federal courts. And the idea here was that understanding and knowing the ignoble and ugly history of the way some southern states dealt with what were now freedmen, African Americans, that it wasn't enough just to have these issues of habeas resolved on the state level. They needed a more neutral, national, powerful forum to check these decisions. So we had a period where there was an increase in state to federal habeas petitions in the United States, but just as Reconstruction is a very sad story, not because of the good things that the North and the national government tried to do in the South, but it's sad because the commitment to freedom and equality dies so quickly during Reconstruction. I mean, really by the mid-1870s, the commitment is waning considerably after Grant's presidency. And so is the case, and such is the case with habeas as well. And it goes into a little bit of a decline, and would decline. We would see less cases going from the state to the federal level on these fundamental issues of equal rights and basic fairness issues with respect to African Americans, other kinds of minorities, for example. But it's really in the 20th century, in the 50s and 60s, that habeas really comes alive again. As I said at the beginning, habeas is really an umbrella right, more of a procedural right that within itself encompasses substantive rights. And in the 1950s and 60s, we of course have the Warren Court revolution in the United States. We have a tremendous amount of constitutional reform in areas from voting rights to education, and especially to criminal procedure. And habeas actually was the vehicle through which those rights were enforced. It was really the carrot and the stick to get states to fall in line with the Warren Court's criminal procedure due process revolution of the 1960s. Now, the Warren Court's criminal procedure revolution was somewhat controversial, so it's not surprising then that from the 70s onward, as the court became more conservative and more Republicans occupied the executive branch, became president, you would see maybe new commitments or different commitments to different sorts of rights, or attempts to even roll back commitments to rights recognized in the 1960s. And it's not unsurprising then that those kinds of political coalitions would go after habeas corpus and try to kind of rein its ability to remove cases from state to federal courts, because they knew how important and how potentially powerful the writ could be in recognizing a right or not recognizing a right, and getting states to fall in line on certain kinds of issues and not to. And that is really the story of habeas today as well. Those who agree with the criminal procedure revolution of the 1960s want strong federal habeas corpus that can go into and receive from states these types of cases through habeas and to resolve them in ways that are consistent with their view of what the criminal procedures of the Bill of Rights entail. And those who think that those procedures are too liberal or not strong enough or not tough enough want to decrease, if not completely eliminate, habeas corpus, not federal habeas corpus, for state prisoners. But the flip side of the habeas coin is habeas during extraordinary periods of war or crisis. And of course, the most famous example of this was Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus during the Civil War. We have to understand, and his critics certainly pointed this out, that the habeas clause is in Article 1. Article 1 constitutes the legislative branch. Now, the habeas clause simply says the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it. The natural influence then, or the natural inference then, is that this is Congress's power to suspend or not suspend. Although it doesn't specifically say it's Congress's power to suspend or not suspend. It just happens to be within that article that for the most part talks about the powers that Congress has and the limitations to Congress. Article 1 also talks about limitations on states, too, so it's not a complete win of an argument to say that it is Congress's and Congress's power alone to suspend, although many people, including many in Lincoln's own administration, agreed that what he did was probably not right. Nevertheless, the Congress that was coming in just 2.5 months after his first suspension in a limited part of the country agreed that they would retroactively okay his suspension by passing legislation that allowed him to do it in the future, and and in a sense kind of saying it was legitimate in the past as well. There were some habeas issues in World War II, obviously, dealing with those interned on the West Coast, Japanese internment. But in just the few minutes that we have left for this lecture, I want to talk about habeas in the War on Terror, because those are the most recent cases, and those are the cases in which I think we can really understand what the larger issues are with respect to habeas. The issue with habeas is simply this, with respect to the War on Terror. Are those who are deemed enemy combatants by the President of the United States and held at Guantanamo Bay, Camp X-Ray, entitled to challenge their status as enemy combatants through a writ of habeas corpus in federal courts? That's the question. Well, you should already have a tiny feel for the potential power that habeas has. Again, if there's no evidence, there's no reason that you're holding someone, they are to go free. So that might be one thing if we're talking about somebody who might be detained in a local town or something like that for any variety of reasons, but someone who might be detained during war might seem more dangerous than that person. And there might be some balancing that we might want to do about how far we want to extend habeas rights. Well, Congress, fearing that this was the case, and because it's Congress's power to do this, Article 3 of the Constitution allows Congress to determine the appellate jurisdiction of federal courts. So Congress, knowing that it might be the case that a certain amount of people at Guantanamo may be having some kind of intelligence, there might not be any basis to hold them or to designate them as enemy combatants and therefore hold them in the way that we still do at Guantanamo, sought to get rid of habeas corpus for those individuals and passed a series of pieces of legislation that in part provided, in a sense, that no or prohibited habeas writs from Guantanamo Bay detainees to federal courts. The court said no in the Hamdan case, and then Congress came back and said, oh, we really meant it when we said no. They are not to have habeas access. We're going to pass this law again, but be more specific in our language. In the first bill, there was an issue about those who were there at a certain time and then those who were there after a period of time. The second bill, the Military Commissions Act, was more specific that absolutely no federal court jurisdiction through habeas for these folks. And then the court in Boumediene, though, just 3 years ago, or 3.5, almost 4 years ago now, said no. Congress cannot do this. Everybody at Guantanamo has the ability to challenge their designation as an enemy combatant, not their ability, not the government's ability to hold them, but their designation as an enemy combatant, which allows the government to do different things to them. That is, and you are able to challenge that categorization, that classification. And to end here then, we see all three branches here coming together, not necessarily in a good way, right? All three branches fighting over power and access, right, during a time of war, about issues as fundamental as your right not to sit in a jail on an island without any charges against you, if that's the case. One of the most fundamental things you could imagine, right? And we see the system, hopefully, working out for the best. At the end of the day, the court's decision, whether you like it or not, is a check against the other two branches of government. And if that's not something that's good, I would actually say it's something that's great. So, thank you.
Freedom 101 is made possible by generous support from Woody Young and the University of Oklahoma Alumni Association. Freedom 101 is a program of the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage at the University of Oklahoma. For more videos and podcasts, visit freedom.ou.edu.